Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And today I'm going to be making some pixel art inspired by the Tamagotchi, everyone's favorite handheld digital pet from the 90s. To make it interesting and kind of easier in a way, I'm going to start by creating a 3D model to sort of find my own unique design, and then translate that into pixel art. To do this, I'll be working in Clip Studio Paint today, because while it's primarily an illustration software, you're able to drop predefined materials onto your canvas. And one of the things they recently added were these 3D primitives. And these are a handful of basic shapes that you can add to kind of assist you in creating a scene that you can then paint over later. Although you can't exactly sculpt these, you are able to resize and rotate them around. And you can overlap multiple shapes to build up these more unique forms. So here I'm adding a prism as the bottom of the device. And the nice thing is that the pieces will sort of snap together, so you're at least able to be accurate with the way that you go about combining shapes. The fact that there's only a limited set of primitives to pull from, and that the kinds of operations you can perform on them are somewhat limited themselves, that kind of works really well for me, because this is sort of a similar mindset as when doing pixel art. You know, where there's this like set of restrictions and you have to get a little bit creative and abstract with how they're used. So there's a lot of stuff that's just made from cubes here, but I figured like if I didn't want it to be so perfectly square corners and all that kind of stuff, I could round out the corners when converting this to an illustration later. But one of the other unique design features was that I've sort of deformed and stuck a sphere into the side of the device here, which I pictured to be kind of like this scroll wheel that you can navigate through the menu and just other functions related to the pet. I also used the spheres to create this keychain portion, like kind of going off that style where it's the small ball bearing type of look rather than links. And then the other thing I wanted to do was I got the idea that the front buttons could be styled into being like the kind that you would see on an arcade machine, where they're sort of circular with that outer wall on them. There's no actual cylinder object here to use, so I used the prism for this for now. And then to create the bordering, I duplicated that piece in place and rescaled and recessed it a little bit. So you end up with this perfect concentric border around that original one. So after making a few other small additions of detail, this is what I've got for the model so far. This is pretty much like the finished state as far as the structuring goes, and it definitely served the purpose of essentially just being a tracing object for the pixel art illustration. But the last thing, just to give a bit of polish for fun, is that you can actually color each of the shapes here. So I went ahead and pre-planned a color scheme for the model. This is kind of nice because it at least gives you a more real feel to it in a sense. And I even went back in to place that wireframe box over the screen, just to kind of substitute for the idea of a pixel display on the device. To create the pixel illustration, I've created a new layer, and I'm using the line tool to basically just play connect the dots around the object here. I've positioned the model off to the side because I've got an idea just for something to fill out that space on the left. And for the illustration, I'm using a canvas size of 180 by 180 pixels. One of the things that you'll notice about the canvas size is that the model itself, now that it's no longer the active layer being selected anymore, is now being rendered at the actual pixel resolution. And it's nice to have it work this way. We've got like the high res look while creating the model, but then finally sort of seeing it rendered down like this is a more useful guide for making the line work trace, because you can already get a sense of how the angles and the pixel segments can fit together. So continuing on here, I'm just doing a few laps around the model and trying to outline all the pieces, but then I'm also taking a few liberties and expanding on a few details to achieve a bit more than was present on the model. Or also just rounding certain pieces a bit, like with the corners and the buttons and that. For the pet design on the screen, I'm freestyling a cat design in this space. And by the way, my sort of screen size here ends up being about 35 by 25 pixels, give or take. From what I could find, the resolution of the original product was 32 by 16, but they did have some that were smaller than that, some that were larger than that, like the Tamagotchi Friends line was 48 by 31 pixels apparently. Not that I was trying to adhere to any real-world specifications necessarily, but the point being that we're kind of in a similar ballpark of design space at least. One difference is that the original product uses a lot of those like baked-in preset icons, which are not pixel-based, whereas I kind of threw those into the pixel art for mine, so that does take up a bit of the space too. With the coloring, I wanted to find something that was really kind of punchy, but kind of soft too. I guess like those terms are sort of at odds with each other, but like something that's between vibrant day glow and pastels, just something that could provide kind of a playful retro flair, I suppose. So I was kind of playing around with a lot of pinks and greens and cyans and stuff like that. And I continued to tweak and balance these colors as more kept getting added. One color that I really liked was the sort of washed out yellow-green for the display. So to have that one appear as more of a pop of color, I eventually backed off the background into something a little bit more neutral. And then that kind of gave the screen color more focus visually, which was appropriate because I filled out the remaining space on the canvas here with these little screen variant callouts, just so we could sort of establish more of an idea of how this thing looks in some of the other modes. Going along with the cat theme, I mocked up a few scenarios here, like with feeding the cat and playing with a laser pointer, stuff like that. My favorite though has got to be this one here of what's supposed to be a sort of scratching minigame command. So I decided to throw in a couch that they're tearing up for that. Sort of like this idea that even in the realm of this being like a pre-programmed digital pet, they would still disobey your instruction to use a scratching post and instead ruin your furniture, albeit in digital form, but still. To polish everything up, I've added some highlights and shading to the device. And for a lot of this, I started using this dithering brush. So you can choose a brush size with this, and it just lays down a checkerboard pattern within that area that you paint out. So this is really handy for just getting some really quick texture in here. And then for the background, I threw in a grid by copy pasting out a bunch of lines. And then just to give it some additional pattern over top of that, I detailed out a few shapes that could be repeated out into kind of that like rad 90s type of pattern, I guess. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the final artwork for my Tamagotchi inspired design. Here we go. Alright, for the finishing here, I've added a slight drop shadow to give some dimension to these items. But then obviously the bigger focal point here for the finishing is the slight bit of animation that's been added as well. And most of these are just a couple of frames or like a handful of unique poses or whatever. But what's interesting here is that I gave it this sort of lagging effect on the display screen. So basically, as the animation transitions to the new pose, there's one frame where it overlaps the previous frame as a transparency, just so you feel a bit of sluggishness or kind of like an organic feel in those transitions, as if the display is kind of taking time to settle into its new frame. As far as this whole idea of creating pixel art from an underlying 3D model, I just wanted to mention that I was recently invited to do a guest series of exactly this over on the Clip Studio Paint channel. So if you want to see more of this kind of thing, I'll leave a link to that 3-part series below. This video, the one that we're in right now, wasn't sponsored or anything. I've just kind of had a lot of fun with this workflow, and I feel like there's a lot of utility in certain projects for this kind of thing, so I hope you enjoyed seeing that as well. And we'll close this out with some CRT time. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.